Today our usual Greek reader, Larissa, isn't with us. Алло, Лариса, добрый день.
Михаил Георгиевич,
Да-да. Алло.
Да?
Да-да.
я разберусь минут за 5, но просто я опаздываю в результате, потому что там какие-то пароли нужны и так далее.
Окей.
Угу.
Хорошо. Larissa will join us in a couple of minutes, as well as Masha. While they're absent, I suggest I take upon myself the duty of reading the Greek text. So let's start, and Larissa and Masha will join us. We proceed with the literal apocalypse. Kai pervomenu autu ectu heru legei auto heis ton mateton autu, didaskale. Ide potapoi litoi, kai potapai oikodomai, kai ho Iisus eipen auto. Blepes tautas tas megalas oikodomas. Uma fete ahode litos epiliton, hos ume katalute. Kaketameno autu eis to oroston laion, ketenansi tu heru, eperota auton kat idion Petros kai Iakobos, kai Ioannes kai Andreas. Eipon hemin. Pote taute estai, kai tito semeion, hotan mele tauta syntelestei panta. Ode Iisus erxete legin autois, blepete metis humas planese. Polloi elefsontai, epito onomatimu legontes, hoti egoimi, kai polus planesusin. Hotan de accusete polemus, kai equas polemon, me troeiste, dei genestai, al upo totelos. Egertestai gar etnos, ep etnos, kai basileia epi basileien, esundai seismoi kai ta topus, esundai limoi, arche odinon tauta. Blepete de humeis heutus, parados sin humas eis synedria kai eis synagogas, dereseste, kai pihegemonon kai basileon stateseste, reneken emu eis martyrion autois. Kai eis pantata etna proton dei keriuchtenei to Евангелион. То давайте, может быть, здесь вот после 10 стиха делаем паузу, потому что наши перекопы, маленький апокалипсис, она большая. Давайте перейдем к русскому тексту. Когда Иисус выходил из храма, один из учеников сказал ему: «Учитель, взгляни, какие камни, какие здания». Иисус ответил ему: «Видишь эти огромные здания? Видишь? Или смотри». Какое здесь значение имеет на случай греческое блепо? Больше похожее на «видишь» русское или больше похожее на «посмотри»? От них не останется и камня на камне. Все будет разрушено. Когда Иисус сидел на Масличной горе, напротив храма, то Петр, Иаков, Иоанн и Андрей, оставшись с ним наедине, спросили его: «Скажи нам, когда это случится? И какой будет знак, что все это уже близко?» Иисус ответил им: Помните, много раз мы здесь отмечали, что такое плеонастическое, лишнее употребление глагола «архумай» – это такая характерная вещь для стиля Марка. В некоторых случаях вроде бы понятно, о чем здесь идет речь. Какая-то вещь, которая только-только начинается или упоминается впервые. Иногда непонятно, какой оттенок придает этот архумай. Нужно ли его передавать по-русски? Иисус ответил, или Иисус стал отвечать им. Смотрите, как бы кто вас не обманул. Многие придут к вам, назвавшись моим именем, скажут, это я, и многих обманут. Когда до вас дойдут весть, но буквально когда услышите про войны и слухи о войнах, не пугайтесь, так и должно быть. Но это еще не конец. Народ пойдет войной на народ, царство на царство. Во многих местах будут землетрясения, будет голод. Это начало родовых мук. Будьте готовы. Это такой, может быть, немного более динамический перевод у меня греческого. Смотрите за собой. Я не знаю, как это было бы возможно передать одновременно ближе к греческому тексту и осмысленно по-русски. Блепет это юмейс эутус. Вас станут предавать суду синедрионов и избивать в синагогах. Из-за меня вам придется предстать перед наместниками и царями, и вы будете свидетельствовать обо мне перед ними. То есть немножко как бы расширил греческое из мартюрион аутоис. Мне кажется, это вполне, может быть, легитимная вещь. И то Евангелион, насчет того, как проводить Евангелион, мы уже неоднократно здесь говорили, не уверен, что радостная весть – это идеальный перевод. Может, действительно, благая весть, более традиционная. Должна быть сперва или заранее. Протон. Провозглашена, проповедана всем народам. Вот мы прочли здесь греческий текст и русский текст. Вот, и по мере чтения этой нашей диглотты я какие-то моменты здесь отметил, которые с точки зрения перевода, может быть, стоило бы как-то обсудить. Прежде чем говорить о смысле, давайте об этих местах посмотрим. Блэпейс. Видишь? Или посмотри, посмотришь. Нормально перевод видишь? Это какая-то такая, скорее, может, даже стилистическая вещь, чем связанная с семантикой греческого блэпа.
По-русски я сильно разницы не вижу.
Ну, хорошо, тогда оставляем, видишь. Не останется от них и камня на камне, буквально уме афетего да элитос эпилитон, который не был бы разрушен. Все будет разрушено. Может, даже греческий текст немножко сильнее, чем
Поставила слово годы здесь, нет? Здесь.
Что-что?
Годы, мне кажется, стоит оставить, нет?
Может быть. Я как бы перевел годы как от них. Может быть, здесь да, нормально. Пускай бы здесь. Видите, огромный камень. Останется и камни на камне. По-гречески как бы буквально не просто здания окажутся разрушенными, но Даже камень на камне будет разрушен. Легитимен такой перевод я сделал, все будет разрушено. Или делать бы боль буквально. Если останется и камни на камне, который не был бы.
Мне кажется, если стилистически сделать камня на камне, который бы не был разрушен, по смыслу-то то же самое, но речево это как-то более сильно, что ли, звучит. Ну, то есть как-то одеяло на себя еще перетягивает. Все будет разрушено как-то звучит, ну, так же по смыслу, но более мягко. А вот который бы не был разрушен, то есть это прям все охватывает, то есть дополнительный какой-то акцент делает.
Так хорошо. Как у вас?
Мне тоже.
Ну, давайте так оставим. Здесь, я думаю, речь идет не про то, что камень как таковой должен быть уничтожен, а про то, что ум – это люты, который не будет сдвинуться со своего места. Эпилитал. Ну вот мы подходим к этому самому странной марковой манере употребления архумай. Joel, we met with this unnecessary archomai in Markan narrative quite a lot of times. It seems that he loved this construction, archomai plus infinitive. And sometimes we try to guess what might have been the meaning behind this. Sometimes we failed to understand the meaning of the shade of meaning that may be behind this. What can we say
Yes.
about
some of the grammarians talk about a pleonastic archomai, which is sometimes just equivalent to an imperfect. But I mean, I think there are cases where you could see some special meaning, like it's also used. Well, it's interesting. It's also used at the beginning of chapter 4, and maybe in the parables chapter, and maybe there you could say that it does mean he began to speak in parables. This is a selection of what he said. But here it's kind of difficult to see, you know, a lot of significance in the Erxito Legain. But I don't know. I think in my translation, I would still try to retain it rather than, you know, what you're doing is just changing it into equivalent to an aorist or an imperfect of Lego. I mean, I don't know what he was doing with it, but I mean, is it really that confusing if you gave a more literal translation?
can we say that this erxato, with the reference to Jesus, erxato plus a verb of saying or proclaiming, marks the beginning of some important passages or speeches. Let's look at how the verb is used in the Gospel. You mentioned Mark 4:1, Palin erxato didaskei, paratesen.
Not only important, but also just long speeches.
Sorry?
It looks like this Exeter starts long speeches.
But not every saying, but rather the beginning of a lengthy speech.
Mhm.
For example, in chapter 4, the beginning of the series of parables.
Well, yeah, how about 145 though? You skipped over chapter 1, verse 45. That's just a summary statement. Yeah.
Yes, but here Jesus is not the subject.
Okay, that's true.
So for
Okay.
one, 520 is in fact has the same meaning as 145.
Okay.
That can we say that in both cases this pleonastic archomai is related to the beginning of a mission to the Gentiles?
Well, I think you could say that in in the second one, but not in 145.
Oh yes,
This is a man.
here,
This is
yes,
leper
yes,
with man
yes,
skin disease.
yes.
Yeah.
Here's the beginning of mission to the Jews, and in 520, the beginning of mission to Gentiles. So probably once again, Aristotle, with reference to the cured people, is important here. Mark 8:31. Is this the first proclamation?
Yeah, it's the first passion prediction. Yeah.
The first passion prediction. It seems that this, at least in many cases, it's not just a stylistic thing or just a pleonastic way of saying what can be said otherwise, but rather marks important things.
Yeah, I mean, in
Especially.
1032, it's not the first time that he has
Yes.
prophesied his passion. So, I mean, if you have any exceptions, any cases where it doesn't, where it seems to be merely stylistic, then, you know, that just makes me wonder if maybe we're reading into, you know, these other cases, something that, you know, could be true, but how do you prove its probability? That's always my question.
Okay. But still, let's keep this pleonastic usage in Russian, huh? In Russian, and as you did it in your English translation.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd rather keep it in case it maybe does mean something, you know, that somebody will discover at some point and that they wouldn't discover if we gave a translation, you know, that doesn't
Yes.
preserve the literal meaning. I mean, I've also wondered if the use of this might relate to a Markan idea that, you know, the Jesus who speaks in the gospel is still speaking, you know, so, um, you know, like at the beginning of the parables chapter, those parables are still going out into the world, even through this book, this gospel book. And So I think I may have mentioned before, at the beginning of the book of Acts, Luke also, he talks about, he says that in the first book, I told you everything that Jesus began to do and to say when he was still amongst us. So, you know, and lots of people have taken that as just stylistic, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is implying that Jesus is still speaking and doing things through the church. And you could point to the parallelism that scholars have noted between the things that Jesus does and says in the gospel and the things that the disciples do in Acts. So, you know, there's a lot of that sort of parallelism. So maybe Luke is operating with a similar idea that the gospel, his own gospel, just presents the beginning of the story. And in Mark's case, the beginning of the story is over on Easter morning. That's the end of the beginning. And he says his gospel is, you know, the first verse of the gospel is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. But maybe he thinks that the whole gospel narrates the beginning, and that you know, but the story continues and is narrated in Acts.
Some exegetes and translators relate this erxato in the first verse of Acts with achri in the second verse, so that erxato refers to the beginning of his deeds, and his words, while Hamera entelaminus tos apostolos diapneumatos hagiu, he was on the left, marks the end. But probably you're right that here we have the beginning without the end. What do we say with the reference to this idea that this erxato is like the opening, and achriches emeres on the left is like the end of the temporal span of the first book?
Well, yeah, I like that. It's so that this would make Jesus being taken up, described in verse 2, that's the end of the beginning. Yeah. But again, it's not the end of the whole story.
Okay.
Because the whole story continues through the Spirit. And the Spirit, in the book of Acts, the Spirit, guidance by the Spirit replaces guidance by the Jesus of history himself.
So this erxato in Acts marks the beginning, while achriches emeres analepte, not the end, but the provisional end, so to speak.
Right, and he's referring to ton proton logon. You know, that is his first volume. Yeah. Yeah, provisional. Well, as I said, I think of it as the end of the beginning.
Okay.
Is what
the end of the beginning.
The beginning is what the Gospel of Luke, or maybe we could say the Gospel of Mark, narrates. That tells you the beginning. But the story continues. So I don't know. I like this interpretation. Maybe I'm reading too much in, but you know, I already needed to think about this when I was thinking about Mark chapter 1, verse 1. You know, what is the meaning of arche tu evangeliu there?
Okay.
And, you
By
know,
the
some people think that that only refers to the first section of the gospel, like the narrative about John the Baptist. But I argued in my commentary that yes, it does refer to that, but then there's also an extended sense in which it can refer to the, you know, this chapter 1, verse 1 to 16:8 of Mark.
By the way, since we already started discussing the book of Acts and the composition of the overall work of Luke, I have a question which arose last week, I believe, in our New Testament course when we were discussing the book of Acts and its dating, and the strange thing that if the book of Acts is to be dated after the Jewish war, as it is commonly dated, I think that the most widespread dating is somewhere in the 80s. Why didn't Luke make any reference to the events of the great uprising and of the Jews being defeated by the Romans, which might have been a very good argument in the discussion between first Christians and the Jews. Later on, you know, this argument repeats again and again in the writings of the church fathers, that your defeat is God's punishment for your unbelief in Jesus. If the Gospel of Luke and Acts were written in the 80s, then why there is no reference to these events? And in discussing this problem, we paid attention to the very last words of the book of Acts, which says that ανέμενεν ο Paulus διετίαν hollen in idiom stomati, that he lived for 2 years in the place that he rented, and people came to him, and he was proclaiming the kingdom of God. But this doesn't look as an end of a completed work, because after having read that Paul ανέμενεν διετίαν hollen, okay, if I read in the last words of a certain novel that after this Michael lived for 2 years in Rome, the natural question is, okay, and what happened after these 2 years? What? Why do we speak about 2 years? What was the end of these 2 years?
Yeah, so he doesn't, I mean, he probably knows about Paul's death, but he doesn't narrate it. So
Okay,
there's a
let's
lot of
narrate this.
things that happen, you know, that can happen after the end of a book that a narrator chooses not to talk about. I mean, in this case, you know, Luke has told us at the beginning of Acts, well, Jesus has said, that the disciples are going to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so people often say that with Paul arriving at Rome, he has reached the ends of the earth. He has reached the point from which probably, or maybe, the most powerful church in Luke's own day has been founded. And so, it may be an appropriate place to end. And as with Mark, it may be that the readers know about things that happened after the end of the book that the author doesn't either want to or need to tell them about. Maybe everybody knew that Paul had been martyred, just as everybody knew that Jesus, had appeared to the disciples. And so, if Mark's gospel ends with chapter 16, verse 8, Mark can just allude to that without describing it. But I don't know. I mean, we're playing a guessing game with
Yes, but
why he ended why an author ends where he does.
yes, I guess arose in our discussion. Probably Luke was intending to write a third book,
Mhm.
and this strange putting an end to the second book in the middle of the affairs with Paul living somewhere for 2 years without indicating what happened after these 2 years is a sign of his desire to continue the dialogy and to make it a trilogy.
Well, that's possible. I mean, I think I've said this before. I always tell my students, yes, many things are possible, but what is probable? How do we move from all these intriguing possibilities, all of which have some arguments for them, but how do you move from that to probability?
Yes, that's exactly my question. What would be your opinion? Can we take Luke's silence about the events of the Great War on the one hand, and this strange ending of the second book with Paul's living in Rome for 2 years and without explicit mentioning of what happened after these 2 years? Can we take these two things together as arguments in favor of making this possibility a probability?
Well, I think those are arguments, and those arguments have been made for an early dating of Luke. But on the other hand, there is some evidence against them. Now, for example, in Luke chapter 21, verse 20, there's a much more explicit reference to the destruction of Jerusalem than you get in Mark. And he's building on, Markan passage, but, this looks much more graphic and true to what actually happened than the vague language that you have in Mark about the abomination of desolation. So I would think that it's probable that this is evidence that no matter when we date Mark, either right before or maybe sometimes right after the destruction of Jerusalem, Luke reflects a a later dating in which, you know, he's making explicit the reference to the way in which Jerusalem was leveled.
Yes, I remember this argument about Luke 21:20, but the thing I was asking about, whether this is probable or just possible, is not the early or late dating of Luke. I would rather follow the mainstream in the late dating of Luke, namely in 70s or 80s. But whether we can regard as possibility or as probability the hypothesis about Luke's intention to write a third book, which would, in this case, explain both the absence of references to the Great War and also the absence of references to the future fate of Paul, because he thought he would describe both these things in the third volume.
Well, again, yeah, it's possible, but what's
But you
the
wouldn't
evidence?
take these two arguments as arguments in favor of probability.
I'm not. Well, I'm not. I haven't been convinced of its probability yet.
Okay.
But maybe you know, further arguments could convince me. But I don't know. You know, Paul definitely becomes the most important character in the latter part of Acts. And I mean, how could I guess if you had a third volume, okay, you could describe, you know, Paul in prison and some of the people that he meets and him convincing some and not convincing some, and then his his execution. But I guess it seems to me that the book of Acts completes the story that was begun in the Gospel of Luke well enough that you don't really need a third volume. Luke has shown you, I think, what he wants to show you, which is that this, as I said before, the story of Jesus continues through the Acts of the Apostles and more largely through the church. So the story of Jesus is not over. It will continue until the end, whenever that comes. And so once you've shown that, I don't know. I don't think you need a third volume. And I guess I can think of, I guess it does seem to me that the you know, both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are about beginnings. The you know, Jesus' ministry as the beginning of this new movement, and the book of Acts as the beginning of the church. And you know, if Luke is going to tell you everything that happened after that, then he might have to write 5 or 6 more volumes. But I don't know. It's a possibility.
Okay, it was an interesting discussion, and I just wanted to know what would have been your opinion on this. Sorry for distraction. Let's return back.
And one other thing, and it's precisely this sort of open-endedness that then leads other later writers to sometimes fill in, you know, to, say Paul in his letters refers to a letter to the Laodiceans, but we don't have it. Well, somebody then writes one to make up for what's left open. And so, I do think that this open-endedness of, the fact that the writings that we do have don't like end everything, don't close all the gaps, leads then to the composition of apocryphal works that, are interesting to study in their own right. Anyway, it's an interesting idea.
Okay, I
but
see.
I'm not yet convinced, yeah.
Yes.
Is it
On the level of
is it
our
is this
okay,
popular?
Say what?
Is this idea popular?
Of a third volume of Luke?
Yeah.
I've never heard it before, no.
So it's
Oh.
like else. Okay.
I heard about it, yes. But what can the third book be about if the first book is the good news about Jesus and the second book is the good news about church? And what the third book would be about?
Я слышал такую версию, что Павел проповедовал евреям, а Лука это записал. И это, собственно, послание евреям. Вот. И, может быть, третья книга. Ну, если мы совсем идем в предположение, может быть, она и есть. Потому что там слова Луки, смысл Павлов.
это отдельная история, мне кажется, не с точки зрения содержания, не с точки зрения стиля. Вы в данном случае не правы, но давайте оставим этот вопрос за рамками нашей дискуссии и вернемся к нашему тексту. На уровне отдельных слов и выражений нормально переводить «бляпетеде гемейс геутус» как «будьте готовы». Как вроде бы смысл примерно такой. Я не знаю, можно ли передать этот смысл по-русски более буквальным образом. Что скажете, русскоязычные участники?
Просто фантазия. Остерегайтесь.
Нет, это...
Ну,
Не
я
сильно.
совершенно не знаю ни контекста, ничего.
Что скажете, Маша?
Правильно ли я понимаю? Смысл в том, что осторожно оглядывайтесь.
Да, вот я тоже
Будьте
хотела сказать,
настороже.
да, что скорее что-то вроде будьте настороже или берегитесь, да, потому что как будто вот это вот будьте готовы, это немножко другое, да.
Мне кажется, что в «Будьте готовы» есть некая такая, ну не то чтобы готов, ну вот именно пассивность, что вот склоните голову.
Будьте настороже, да?
Мне кажется, смысл скорее такой.
Ну хорошо, давайте. Смотрите, собой оглядывайте, да? А что означает это самое «будьте настороже»?
Будьте внимательны.
О, а
Ну,
может
и
быть,
что?
внимательно как раз очень хорошо.
Но стилистически не очень.
Ну да.
Мне «Будьте готовы» больше нравится, потому что в 11 стихе там «и когда вас будут предавать». Ну, то есть, как будто бы неизбежность та самая.
Может быть,
Как бы,
будьте бдительны.
будьте настороже или будьте бдительны, немножко ближе к этому самому Блапета. Но что это означает? Когда, допустим, я кому-то говорю, будьте настороже или будьте бдительны, что вот что-то такое на вас кто-то попробует напасть из-за угла, а вы не поддаваетесь, вы от них убегите. Вот. А здесь речь как раз идет о том, что вам все равно от этого не убежать. Понимаете, да? Разница между русским «будьте готовы к тому, что вас арестуют», и «будьте настороже, вас могут арестовать», очень
Учтите,
существенная. Что?
учтите, учтите.
Учтите.
Ну, это совсем не блепеты, конечно.
Это, да, но понимаете, что будьте готовы, значит, что с вами этого случится, это неизбежно, но вы должны быть к этому готовы. А будьте настороже, это с вами попытаются такое сделать, но вы от этого дела можете ускользнуть.
Да.
Но речь идет, скорее, это все-таки про первую интерпретацию. Будьте готовы.
Или, может быть,
Что-что?
готовьтесь, может быть.
This terminology recurs in verse 33, right? Or somewhat
Yes.
similar.
Verse 33.
And it's interesting,
Да.
you know, it sort of frames the whole narrative, you know.
So it's like expressions that marks the beginning and the end of the whole pericope. And maybe Mark 13:33 explains the meaning in this verse.
I mean, it's some sort of warning and call to attention, right?
Мгм. Может, просто смотрите же.
Да, вот это хорошо, по-моему.
А там нету противопоставления с тем, что будет происходить в мире и, ну, в общем, и с тем, что будет происходить с непосредственно учениками. То есть там двумя стихами ранее говорится про то, что будет в мире, а Иисус говорит: а смотрите теперь, что будет происходить с вами.
Я думаю, что вот особенно в контексте 33-го стиха, который сказал Джоэль, да? Лепция группнейте ук ойда тагар вот его айросестин. И ну вот кто будьте бдительны, осмотрительны не в смысле того, что вам удастся избежать того, о чем идет речь дальше, суда синдрионов, избиений в синагогах и так далее, а в смысле того, что будьте бдительны, не поддавайтесь вот этому обману. По сути дела, по-видимому, вот, по крайней мере, в той форме, какой у Марка вот эта речь фигурирует, она очень полемическая. И она полемизирует с разнообразными лжемессианскими представлениями, лжемессианскими с точки зрения Марковой общины, о том, что вот уже сейчас второе пришествие началось, многие придут к вам, назвавшись моим именем, смотрите же, будьте бдительны в этом отношении, а не в том отношении, что вы можете избежать суда Синедриона. Вы можете действительно просто оставить смотрите же.
Вот, может быть, действительно, смотрите же, вот оно как-то хорошо.
Окей? Прекрасно. Значит, что-то мы здесь у нас придумали, как улучшить. Да. И вы будете свидетельствовать обо мне перед ними. Выделил эти слова желтым, потому что это такой расширенный перевод «эйс мартирио наутойс». Мне кажется, наверное, это легитимно в данном случае.
Михаила, можно экран, пожалуйста?
Можно что?
Экран вернуть.
Экран вернуть. Давайте вернем экран. Тоже против. Вот экран возвращается к нам.
Can I say something about the what people talk about when they talk about this chapter often is just the events to which Mark is referring and whether or not they have happened yet. And
Yes.
this already starts with verse 2. You know, I mean, is this a prophecy that has now been fulfilled, or does it refer to something that hasn't happened yet? Because it says that there won't be one stone left on another without being thrown down.
Mhm.
And of course, there are some stones left, you know, from the Second Temple, namely the Western Wall. So people can get out of this by saying, well, it's not really, it wasn't really, you know, part of the building. It was the retaining wall of the building, but still it's a problem. And then the larger problem is in the rest of the chapter, Jesus standing in AD 30 seems to be prophesying, you know, a whole eschatological scenario, which lots of people interpret as including the destruction of the temple in AD 70, but that's only the beginning of the end time events, which are to then unfold and, you know, and culminate in Jesus' return. It seems like one big series of events. And so the whole chapter seems to be a witness to an imminent eschatology, which the subsequent 2,000 years of history has falsified. And therefore, there's a lot of, if you can go back to chapter 13, verse 3, verse 4, people pay a lot of attention to let's see. Well, both the disciples question in verse 2 and Jesus answer in verse 4. Or their let's see, or their question in their question in verse 4. When will these things be, and what will be the sign that all things will come to pass? And people want to separate those two, these things, from all things. But I think it's, you know, it's an attempt to deal with the delay of the parousia for 2,000 years. And that's the problem that is posed by this chapter, and that has been posed by these eschatological predictions, you know, since the first century.
Yes. So, what can we say about the dating of this text? Amen lego himina hotiuma parelte hegene a haute. Me Chrisutauta panta genetai. Obviously, these words couldn't have been said or invented later than one generation after the time of Jesus.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay, but if
And what is, what is this chapter trying to do? Is it trying to accelerate eschatological expectation, or is it trying to dampen it? Because is it trying to make people think that the end is imminent, or that it's not so imminent? Because you do have Jesus saying in this chapter, the end is not yet. These things must be, but that won't yet be the end. But I think it's also important to think about the chapter as being spoken by the character Jesus in this story in AD 30 or 32 or something, but then being read 40 years later, maybe, by Mark's readers, like a generation later. So it might be that that the readers would have thought that verse 30 referred to them. All these things will come to pass within a generation or so, that is, in our own time.
what do you mean by Regina Haute? If the gospel events took place in the beginning of 30s, and then people who were grown up at that time, they would have been in their 60s during the Great Uprising.
They would have been, yeah, and it's so that the import of verse 30 is similar to that of Mark 8:39 or 9:1. There are some of you standing here who won't taste death until you see the kingdom of God come in power. And that also is suggesting that the end is going to come within, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 years of the date of Jesus' crucifixion. And for this reason, then, some exegetes starting in the 2nd century search for other ways to interpret Genea, right? For example, as a reference to the Jewish people. But, that sort of exegetical attempt, I think it's directed at the problem of the delay of the parousia and a way of getting around that.
This means that either Mark kept the earlier words intact, even although they contradicted the context in which Mark and his community lived, or you must date Mark about the time of the great resurrection, but not significantly later, maybe even a bit earlier.
Right. So this does come into those discussions, right?
Sorry?
That these sort of considerations do come into those discussions about the dating of Mark. And some would argue that it must be before 70 because of, because of the way in which the rest of the chapter links the abomination of desolation with, these end time events. people always say that, one good way to date an apocalypse is when it moves from being very specific to being very vague. Like, Daniel chapter 7, for example, and other passages in Daniel have, just very explicit references to historical events, and then all of a sudden, the language becomes more vague. I mean, does that happen here? I'm not sure. But I would think that verse 9 and 10, Mark's readers are supposed to think this is what's happening now. These sort of persecutions are what we are experiencing. And yet the gospel is being preached, to the whole world. And so the end is going to come soon.
Okay, the gospel, or Jesus as the main character of this narrative, is saying some statements that may be regarded as polemical. First, Jesus in Mark says that there will be an end to Jerusalem and to Jerusalem temple. That's verse 2. But then it's very important that Mark and Jesus predicts that there will be pseudo-Christs, pseudo-Messiahs. Verse 6, but you shouldn't believe them. I think this is very important for dating Mark.
Yeah, and that's repeated even more explicitly in verse 22. There shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and they will give signs and wonders so as to deceive, if possible, the elect.
Yes. So we may think that the gospel was written and reflects the situation where the early Christian community, at least the community of Mark, had to struggle against these pseudo-prophets, pseudo-Christs, and pseudo-Messiahs.
And this is one of the reasons that I, date the gospel and situate it around the Jewish war itself. Right?
Yes.
Because
but I think that verse 7 is also polemical.
Mhm.
You will hear about wars and there will be rumors about wars, but this is not the end yet. The polemics against pseudo-Christs and pseudo-Messiahs is somehow linked with this idea, because real Messiah and real Christ, they will appear at the very end, and the very end is described later. But probably these pseudo-Messiahs and pseudo-Christs, they appear simultaneously with the beginning of wars and rumors about wars. But this is not the end yet. So probably the context of Mark, or at least the context of this particular text, is the situation where the war is at hand. The war is approaching. Yes, akwai polemon. But it is not here yet. But
Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe what he's saying is that when, see, this is again, you know, the question about where is Mark as the narrator standing? You know, is he standing in the same place that he's describing here, or is he standing in a somewhat later place? You know, that is, you know, when you hear about wars and rumors of wars and false messiahs and stuff, that's not the end yet. But what seems to start the real end is the abomination of desolation. When that happens, then the end is near. So it was everything was in a preliminary stage, you know, what the rabbis called the, you know, the labor pains of the Messiah, until the abomination of desolation. And that seems to be a, you know, a rift in time. Hotan de idite to bedelugma. When you see that, and then he tells the readers, pay attention to this, right? Wana genoskon noeto, then you should run away.
yes, but for Mark and Jesus, this bedelegma tes eremosios is almost simultaneous with the final coming of the Messiah, because the curious will shorten these days, so that there will be a very short period between the bedelegmates eremosios and the final end.
Yes. And that's the problem, you know, for Christian interpreters since the first century, is that it seems to describe, you know, like a very short course of events initiated by the abomination of desolation and leading quickly to like the collapse of the universe and the return of Christ.
Yes, so I think this text allows us to place the gospel, at least this particular text, in the period between the akoaipolemon, namely the beginning of the great resurrection, and the bedelegma erimosos, namely the destruction of the temple. Can we say that the most probable time for writing the Gospel of Mark in the light of this text is a rather short period between the outbreak of the Jewish war and its tragical end?
Yeah, I think that's what I argued at one point, and then I changed my mind. I mean, I think
And
it
why?
could be.
And why did you change your mind?
Well, I can't remember really.
But at least
I
the arguments for this dating, we just looked at them. What are the counter arguments that made you at some point in your career of Mark and scholar change your mind? And you changed your mind for which deity? Earlier or later?
I think I changed my mind from being fairly sure that it was sometime between 66 and 70 to thinking it might be that or it might be after 70.
But you just said that the Christian exegetes, since the destruction of the temple in the destruction of the temple in the year 70, struggled with the obvious contradiction between the fact that the temple is destroyed and there is here Bdelygma Erimosos, but other things that are here depicted as following immediately after the destruction of the temple didn't follow.
Well, okay. So I think eschatological predictions are flexible. And, you know, if you say, you know, and this has happened in the history of theology, you know, if you say the world is going to end tomorrow and then it doesn't end, you can say, well, I didn't literally mean tomorrow, but it was, you know, very soon. And so as long as the gospel is situated very close to the destruction of the temple, I think you could say that the you know, the prophecies in verses 14 and following are still valid. You know, that the destruction of the temple has begun an irreversible process which very soon will culminate in the return of Jesus. You know, and you can maintain that sort of eschatological urgency for a while, you know, maybe for months or years. But when it gets to be like 40 years later or something, then you have to start to reinterpret things. But I don't think that a delay of a few days or a few months or even a few years is a problem to somebody who is expecting the end.
Okay.
And you know, look at the followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, right, who thought he was the Messiah. I mean, his death was a shock, and a lot of people, you know, were dismayed by it. But others said, "Well, he's coming back very soon." So eschatological expectations can readjust.
Okay. But still, the arguments for dating in the early part of the Jewish war are rather important, though of course we do not have the time machine and we cannot be 100% sure. But still the arguments for dating Mark in these years are probably rather weighty.
Yeah, I think I changed my mind between, you know, I wrote an article that was published in Journal of Biblical Literature on the setting of Mark. First, before I wrote the first volume of my commentary, and I think that's where I argued for a dating between 66 and 70. And then when I wrote the introduction to my commentary, I changed my mind. So I'll try to find what I said in my commentary
Okay.
and what it indicates about how I changed my mind. But of course, what I wrote in the commentary, that was a generation ago. I can't be expected to remember that. It's all very vague. But let's see, date, page 37. I'll look at it.
Okay. Before we move to the next part of the eschatological discourse, what do you think about the meaning of this proton? Как нам это лучше передать по-русски? Самое радостное или благовесть должно быть заранее провозглашена всем народам или сперва провозглашена всем народам? Какое слово здесь лучше поставить в качестве перевода греческого протон? Что скажете, русскоязычные участники?
Ну, сперва и заранее. Это же почти одно и то же, нет?
Может быть,
Какая-то легкая здесь есть разница. Что-что?
прежде?
Прежде.
Просто если прежде, то прежде чем что?
Но еще и перед этим, допустим, благовесть должна быть провозглашена всем народам.
Яснее.
Что-что?
Я говорю, это яснее перед этим.
Там можно перед этим.
Мне кажется, прежде очень неплохо. Ну, вот, а насколько, как бы сказать, важно, где стоит это протон.
Ну да,
Что
его
оно
хочется-
подчеркивает
Вот с
именно
точки зрения
пан
русского языка,
какая-этное.
Но прежде радостная весть должна быть провозглашена всем народом.
Но мы прям переводим здесь Кай как
То есть
Аллах.
она прежде должна быть народом или прежде должна быть провозглашена?
Думаю, провозглашена, конечно.
Благовещенная.
А может, все-таки испандета эссени? Ну, то есть сперва в каждом народе, потому что она уже провозглашена, ну, оно, Евангелие, оно уже провозглашено самим Иисусом. И поэтому здесь протон, значит, сначала везде, собственно, в каждом народе. Может быть, здесь на это акцент делается.
Ну, мне кажется, вот так достаточно нейтрально. Можно понять и так, и эдак.
Ну что, вот так оставляем?
Да, хорошо, по-моему.
Хорошо. Перед этим, наверное, нормально.
Слушайте, вот только теперь перед ними и перед этим как-то нехорошо.
Что?
Идет сначала перед ними, а потом перед этим. Чисто стилистически, по-моему, как-то не очень.
Перед ними. Ну что,
Может,
прежде?
прежде? Прежде.
Это прежде того?
Угу. Не, может, просто прежде. Можно прежде того, тоже годится.
Ну, просто прежде того, это значит, прежде чем вы будете свидетельствовать обо мне, к чему относится того? Что такое того? Что это за событие то?
Ну, видимо, да, потому что дальше же идет, когда вас приведут. То есть оно находится как раз между этими двумя фразами. По идее.
Мне кажется, просто здесь прежде это какое-то более общее понятие.
Да, оно, безусловно, более общее.
Пр-
Но
пр- пр-
если ну, вот перед этой, то есть если сравнить 9 и 11, то оно занимает как раз, в общем, как бы вписывается. Но и мне кажется, что можно оставить просто прежде без того.
Да, мне кажется, это
Окей,
просто
да.
самый лучший
Да.
вариант. Ну, чтобы не смущать никого.
И я бы только тогда, может быть, еще 11 начала бы не с а с и, чтобы тоже вот не было этих повторов. Прежде благая весть должна быть провозглашена, и когда вас поведут. Ну, так вот как-то хочется.
Тогда прежде чего? По-русски вот при такой конструкции прежде отсылает к содержанию стиха 9. А на
Да.
самом деле стих 9, равно как и стих 11, они как раз раскрывают это самое провозглашение благой вести. А прежде здесь тогда скорее отсылает не к 9 стиху, а вот к концу мира, да? Понимаете, да? Прежде у нас как бы здесь имеется в виду эпоха, когда благовесть провозглашается, и при этом свидетели предают суду синедрионов, ведут на суд и так далее. И есть эпоха конца. Вот тогда, пожалуй, протон здесь по-гречески, равно как тогда, прежде чтобы не было еще, что у нас здесь должно быть по-русски, должно быть у нас, это имеется в виду, что эпоха свидетельства, она предшествует эпохе конца.
I don't know if this is relevant to what you're talking about, but in Matthew, he changes Mark's terminology to talking about the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed in the whole earth as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come.
Да-да.
That seems to be, that would go along with the prestia, right? That the gospel must first be preached. And that's, and
Ну,
then the end.
Так может, протон отсылает к концу в начальных стихах и написать просто курсивом, но прежде конца или прежде окончания. Если мы хотим просто пояснить, то почему бы не написать прежде конца или прежде окончания? А прежде окончания благая весть должна быть провозглашена всем народам. И тогда это отошлет просто не к 6, 7 там и другим стихам, а там, где это было, во 2, в 3, но это еще не конец.
а если порядком слов просто? Но благая весть всем народам должна быть провозглашена прежде того.
Может быть, вот так. Мы возвращаемся к каким-то более ранним нашим вариантам, потому что прежде в большей степени привязывает данное предложение к ее, данную фразу к ее контексту, чем, скажем, сперва. А сперва более общее. Сперва может отсылать.
Сперва хорошо, но а тогда давайте его. А что если его в начало фразы? Но сперва благая весть должна быть провозглашена всем народам, нет?
Вот почему-то, если мы выносим сперва на первое место, то оно, опять же, привязывается к 9 стиху, к непосредственному контексту. А когда сперва куда-то загоняется вглубь предложения, то связь с контекстом оказывается более слабой.
А может здесь просто дословно или но всем народам сперва должна быть провозглашена благая весть. Тогда у нас все сходится, нет?
Хорошо, тогда действительно у нас при таком порядке слов это сперва еще больше загоняется вглубь всем народом. Вот мне кажется, что при таком порядке слов у нас это сперва уже отсылает не к 9 стиху, не к непосредственному контексту, а вот вообще ко всей такой большой ситуации, да? Окей. Мне такое скорее нравится.
Да.
Это хорошее мы сделали сегодня. Дошли до 10 стиха. И такое ощущение, что как раз когда в начале нашей сегодняшней встречи мы приняли решение сделать маленькую паузу после 10 стиха, мы словно бы как некие такие пророки насчет нашего тайминга угадали, что ровно столько времени у нас, что ровно эти стихи у нас займут нашу стандартную пару, полтора часа. Что ж, да. Спасибо всем, кто с нами был.
Спасибо.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joel.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
And we're waiting for your arguments, for explaining why did you change your earlier position on the dating of Mark somewhere in the middle of your career of Mark and scholar.
Yeah, I'll think some more about this. Yeah, I have to
During
go back.
generation,
I also say what?
somewhere in between two generations.
Yeah,
First
a
and
generation ago. Yeah. Also, I want to say, I guess in Russia, birthday isn't such a big thing, but name day is. But today is my birthday.
oh,
Oh, Joel.
congratulations!
So,
No,
No, it's a big day in Russia.
in Russia, in fact, birthday is usually much more important than name's day. And usually in Russian, in this case, we sing in English, happy birthday to you. And that's what I suggest to do now.
okay, but before you do
Happy
that,
birthday to
To
you.
you. Happy
Happy birthday
birthday
to
to
you.
you. Happy
Happy birthday, dear Joel. Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
to
you.
you.
thank you. But I wanted to say, so, I've been thinking about getting old, and so it's appropriate to be talking about the end of all things in this chapter in Mark, when I'm thinking about my own end eventually. So, but the end is not yet. Hokairos uk estin. I don't think.
Yes, we still have a lot to do before our
Yeah.
personal end comes.
Yeah, right. So, okay. Anyway, thank you for your nice song. Nobody else has sung it to me today, so thank you.
Thanks.
And
До свидания.
we
До
also,
До
свидания.
свидания.
we also
До
sing
свидания.
Russian many years, many years.
Yes.
Thank you.
Many happy
Спасибо.
returns.
Thank you. Cheerio.